Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
Good afternoon, Brian. Stay out of the rain.
Good rainy afternoon here in the Washington, D.C. area. Thanks to everybody for being here today and tuning in once again to Embargoed. After our summer vacation, we came back with a vengeance 2 weeks ago, all China all the time. We are going to, as we threatened the last episode, we are changing things up because we are tired of talking about China, quite frankly, and we do it all day, every day when we're talking to our clients. So this is a no China episode, and it is an all lightning round episode. We are just getting radical with the format. So
we are going to go quick and stay out of China if we possibly can.
So we're going to stay out of China. Hopefully we'll not utter the word China after we do the introduction here, and we're going to do all lightning rounds. So we're going to cover many more topics than usual. We're going to do each of them pretty quickly, about 5 to 7 minutes at most. And we're going to try to keep the whole thing under an hour if we can, which is hard because Tim and I tend to talk too much, but we will do our best.
Tight lip today.
Yeah, exactly. Quick thoughts, quick hits. So thanks again to everybody for joining. The usual introductory notes, which is we're not giving legal advice. We're not relying on any confidential information. If you do like the pod, if you're a fan of the pod, please subscribe. Please give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. You can find us anywhere, Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast content. With that, I think we're ready to give the roadmap and jump right in the spirit of the lightning round episode. So as usual, I'll just give a quick roadmap here so you get a sense of the topics, if there's anything you want to skip to. And again, no China. That is our solemn pledge to all of you. No China. China will certainly be here 2 weeks from now when we come back. So I'm sure the next episode will be all China. But we're going to start with North Korea and the recent joint advisory that was put out relating to their ballistic missile program and sanctions and export control sort of implications of that. Then we're going to turn to the first sanctions imposed upon the ICC and some the ICC prosecutor, which just came out last week. Then we're going to turn back to OFAC, and we're going to look at the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed by OFAC with the State of Delaware, the Attorney General's Office, Department of Justice in Delaware. And then we're going to do 2 enforcement actions, one dealing with an individual and one that just came out yesterday relating to Russia, Ukraine. And then we're going to take it home with a quick check-in with Nord Stream 2, specifically what's going on in Germany with Nord Stream 2 in light of more geopolitical intrigue relating to Mr. Putin and the Russian government. We're going to do a quick check-in with Venezuela and the latest designations there. And then we're going to bring it home with a wild card topic. And I will tell you, Tim, I changed up what I'm going to do. So there's actually going to be some sanctions trivia that we're going to do at the end. And you're going to be on the spot for some sanctions trivia.
Oh, God.
Round. So,
oh, God. We'll see how I do on the spot. I tend to panic.
Anybody who knows us knows we did not rehearse this. So I'm going to catch Tim by surprise.
So
we'll see
how
he reacts.
I'm going to go off topic here and maybe when I was in high school, I was on a show called Battle of the Brains. It was a competition among high school students to answer trivia questions, and we were down to the last question, and there was a question about a Simon and Garfunkel song, and the correct answer was "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?" And I buzzed in and said, "Where have you been, Joe DiMaggio?" Which they didn't count, and we lost. So I'm still bitter. So maybe I can make up for that today.
Wow, that is a terrible injustice, and a lot of burden to bear for you.
We're going to right a wrong.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I have confidence in you when we get to that part. So without further ado, let's jump right into our entire lightning round episode. And we're going to start, as I said, with the North Korea joint advisory that was just issued. So we've talked about a number of these over the last few months. these joint advisories issued by multiple agencies of the US government that are highlighting a particular either country threat or subject matter threat. And there was another one just issued last week relating to North Korea, and in particular its ballistic missile program. This was a joint advisory that was issued by the State Department, Treasury, and Commerce. And it functions and was laid out much like many of the other advisories that we've seen, which is it just sort of gives a pretty in-depth overview of the North Korean ballistic missile program and the threat presented there. It lists and catalogs a number of North Korean entities that have been designated and have, for many, many years, many of them, give some red flags and kind of the MO of how they seek to evade sanctions to procure certain items that are needed for the ballistic missile program. And then it runs through the litany of UN and US legal restrictions and sanctions programs and export control programs that touch upon this area in an effort to make it clear sort of how fraught it is to have any dealings, sort of inadvertent or otherwise, with this this enterprise by the North Koreans. So the thing I want to highlight, again, in the spirit of the lightning round, I want to highlight just one thing or two things really quickly. So essentially, this is another effort, in my view, again, for raising awareness in this area, a critical area, and sort of a more traditional area for sanctions and export controls, kind of core military national security concerns. And this has been an existing concern with respect to North Korea for many, many, many years. And for anybody who's in any of the industries that are sort of implicated by this, that this is really directed at, that needs to be heightening their awareness in terms of their compliance with these rules. And this goes for US companies or non-US companies. I would certainly encourage you to read this advisory if you haven't read it already. And in particular, I'm going to flag two things. One is the areas that they call out in terms of the procurement activities relating to the ballistic missile program. In particular, they call it anybody who's involved in the electronics, chemical, metals, materials industries, as well as financial, transportation, and logistics sectors. So to the extent that anybody out there is listening to this that operates and works at a company or advises companies that work in those sectors, it's certainly good practice to be reviewing this alert, this advisory. And I would also add that in the annex that's attached here is essentially a veritable shopping list of a ballistic missile program procurement agent, pages and pages long, that sort of goes through all of the different types of items that might be on the wish list of the North Koreans. And so that also, I think, is worth looking at for anybody in those sectors. That's all I really want to say about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you called it a shopping list, because my first impression was that if the North Koreans didn't know what to look for and what to try and purchase when they want to build a missile program, now they do. I mean, that's like a nice list. I also thought from a compliance standpoint that list was very helpful, because if I were trying to, if I was selling U.S. goods overseas in particular, and I sold anything on that list and exported to Asia and certainly to China, I'd be very scared right now, and I'd want to look into that. Although I guess my other impression of this advisory was it does seem a little late. I mean, the North Korean missile program seems pretty far along, and you would think that a couple years after they've come out with the program, and we've been negotiating with the North Koreans for what now, 2 years to try and dismantle the program, that we would have come out with the advisory a little earlier so that they wouldn't have gotten as far down the road as they did. But it is what it is. I thought it was a good guide for companies that make the products that are on that list and that are in those industries.
As we've said before, perhaps this was on the to-do list of many at those agencies during quarantine, and they finally were able to check this off their list. So perhaps that's why it's coming out now. I don't know. The timing is a little peculiar, given this is such a long-standing threat. But be that as it may, I agree, this is a good tool, and encourage everybody out there who might find this relevant to take a look at it. So with that, let's move on to the ICC.
All right. So the International Criminal Court has been around for a few years. 123 countries are members of the International Criminal Court, including Afghanistan, which will become important in a second. But the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. I believe it was the Bush administration refused to join. We've never signed the treaty, and it's never gotten over the treaty requirements. So the U.S. has never joined the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is currently investigating in Afghanistan what are alleged to be war crimes that involve the U.S. Army. And the Trump administration has been very opposed to this. This is longstanding U.S. policy not to be part of the International Criminal Court, but again, because the events took place in a country that is part of the International Criminal Court, there is arguable jurisdiction over these events, and the International Criminal Court has been investigating. Rather than actually deal with the 123 countries with whom, all of whom, which, or at least the great majority of which we have diplomatic relations and the ability to engage in negotiations about the scope of the International Criminal Court investigations, the Trump administration turned to its favorite policy for all things foreign policy related. It created a sanctions program aimed at the International Criminal Court. And so in June of this year, President Trump signed an executive order allowing the Treasury Department to impose sanctions, OFAC to impose sanctions against ICC investigators who were involved in the investigation of the United States. And recently, I think, was it last week, really in the last 10 days or so.
Yeah,
last week, the U.S. imposed the first set of sanctions with respect to the International Criminal Court. They imposed sanctions against Fatou Bensouda, who is actually the lead investigator for the entire court, and then I'm sure I'm not going to pronounce his name right, but I think it's Fakiso Mochachoko, who is of Lesotho ancestry and is the head of one of the departments of the International Criminal Court. I believe it is which department is it? It's the jurisdiction department of the International Criminal Court, and he's also apparently involved with the investigation. So both of those individuals have now been blocked by the United States as a result of their investigation into the ICC. I think my thoughts on that were kind of hinted at when I mentioned that the United States decided to go down this route rather than actually diplomatically trying to deal with the countries involved in the ICC and seeing if there's some diplomatic way to resolve this, short of sanctioning the investigators from the ICC who are actually just kind of line level investigators carrying out an investigation. I mean, this is the head of investigations, but it's still, the equivalent of sanctioning the head of the FBI because some other country was unhappy with the fact that the FBI was investigating in their country. It seems like a rather extra legal way to proceed on the international scene to me, and I doubt that it is going to be successful in the long run in shutting down the ICC, and in fact it may bolster international support, at least in the short term, for the ICC, when otherwise there may have been less support, because the ICC has their investigations have not been uncontroversial just outside the United States. There's been discussions that they really focus too much on Africa and not on some of the other member states in the ICC. And so I certainly think that had the United States gone down the diplomatic route, there might have been more consensus internationally about what the ICC couldn't do, but it's chosen to go down the sanctions route, and we shall see if that will be successful.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for me on this, and I should say that when this executive order was issued a few months ago and we first discussed it on the podcast, I was on the record on the pod as saying that I don't know if this executive order is ever even going to be deployed or utilized. So I was wrong on that front. I should have known better. But the reaction to this internationally, I think, is what's noteworthy, because this is barely making a ripple here in the US. There was a statement from Secretary Pompeo. I don't think there was even a press release put out by OFAC when the designations came out last week. But internationally, the EU has condemned this. The UK is actually a member of the ICC, so they have had, been some critical comments coming out of the UK. I should note that in addition to the fact the US is not a member, Russia, China, and India are also not members. So
it's a good company.
Good company, but at least four of the largest economies in the world not part of this. I will say that I think in terms of sort of being symbolic of the US's decision to go it alone on these types of issues and to take positions and deploy tactics that are deeply unpopular around the world. This is a sort of another illustration of that. I would also say that I saw a very interesting comment in one of the news reports I read on this, which was, what is to say that the United States is not going to deploy a similar strategy with respect to the World Health Organization,
Right.
who it is furious at regarding COVID and its alleged mishandling of COVID. How long before the head of the WHO is sanctioned? There's a new sanctions program that gets put up, and then at that point, and we've said this before, how much is too much? When does it get to the point where this is all just this is meaningless, or at least in certain contexts it maybe is meaningless and symbolic, and just completely waters down the power of the tool that the U.S. has at its disposal when it comes to sanctions. So I think that's the main takeaway for me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. This turns U.S. sanction policy, at least it has the potential to turn it into a joke, and you don't want that, because essentially, if you use sanctions too much, and you use sanctions in areas where international consensus is not with us on this, and the ability for these sanctions to make meaningful change are really not great in my view. And so you weaken the sanctions tool by using them in instances like this, and you do create this situation where, will the WHO be next? Now, given the developments of the last few days and the fact that apparently the WHO did not fool the U.S. government into thinking that COVID was not dangerous, because apparently at the highest levels, the U.S. government has been well aware of that since January. So the WHO may not be on the chopping block, but maybe they will. Maybe that's where the next sanctions program is.
Scapegoats are valuable, Tim. So you need to find them someplace. So
and we both have failed to anticipate the lengths to which the current government would go in imposing sanctions. So maybe WHO is next.
Nothing would surprise me at this point. So with that, let's wrap up that topic. I'm sure we may come back to that in the future. On to lightning round topic number 3, which is the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed last week and publicized between OFAC and the Delaware Department of Justice. So this is interesting for a number of reasons. So what the MOU actually says and does is not all that interesting, perhaps, and is not all that just different than many other MOUs that I have seen both in my time in government between various agencies to coordinate, to share information, to invest, to conduct investigations jointly, to do training, etc. It contains all those bells and whistles that you would expect to see. I think what's interesting is perhaps with this, the deterrent effect that perhaps this could have, just the announcement of this could have in terms of what it's trying to signal or what it's representing, which is, in one of the bullet points, I'm looking at the press release that was issued, talks about improving transparency into corporate structures used to disguise illicit business dealings. So for anybody who's not familiar with this, and again, we assume people who listen to this podcast are, or anybody who's outside the US, Delaware is, of course, the number one jurisdiction for corporate organization registration in the United States, and has been for many years. So the idea that OFAC would be kind of teaming up with the state government of Delaware to perhaps more effectively share information and investigate shell companies or other interests of sanctioned parties or blocked property or parties that are adjacent to any of those things in an effort to aid their own investigation, Department of Justice investigations, asset forfeiture actions, blocking actions, etc., is interesting, and I think sends a signal, and they're trying to send a clear signal that for those who think you can hide in plain sight in Delaware, those days are over. That's what they're certainly trying to signal. Now, what this amounts to at the end of the day, I don't know. They sort of style it as if there is already ongoing collaboration and cooperation, and this is just kind of cementing that a little bit. And if you take a close look at the MOU, nobody really commits to do anything, because government agencies can never commit to do anything and never want to give up any autonomy. And that is certainly the case here. But again, as a symbolic matter and as a gesture to have some deterrent effect and send a signal that perhaps there's going to be more focus in this area, I think this is an interesting development and one that we'll have to keep an eye on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I heard about the MOU, that my first thought was, it's Delaware. They've got a ton of corporate records, including, U.S. stubs of overseas businesses. This is going to be OFAC now kind of getting inside the candy store and being able to rifle through these records to see, to potentially surface sanctions issues. And so that was my thought. The press release kind of tends to back that up. The MOU is kind of boring and unenforceable and really doesn't address some of the issues that I would have expected to be in there, especially in terms of specifics about corporate records and the exchange of corporate information and maybe the electronic exchange. None of that is in the body of the MOU itself. It is hinted at in the press release. And so to the extent that OFAC is now going to have visibility into Delaware corporate records and potentially, who beneficial owners are and that sort of thing, it could be a big deal. There could be a lot more forfeiture actions, a lot more, designations that arise out of this, but we'll see.
Yeah, agreed. This is a bit of a TBD how impactful this is going to be, but certainly an interesting move. And like I said, just the symbolic value alone, I think, carries a little bit of weight to it. So so wanted to bring that up. With that, let's stay with OFAC and let's go now to an enforcement action that was announced last month relating to an individual, which is not something we see very often.
No, so August 11th, 2020, OFAC announced a settlement for $5,000. Normally, I don't think that would have even made it onto this podcast. So that's how noteworthy it would normally be. But the settlement was with a person, and that is probably the first one I've seen in a long time. You used to see them back in the day. If you went through some of the settlements with U.S. persons, OFAC used to do settlements with people who brought cigars in from Cuba. And so if you kind of go through their 2001, 2002, some of those settlements, but it's been a long time. And so this settlement was just a $5,000 payment, but it was a discussion of a person, a U.S. person who was in the Colombian embassy, who wound up having a personal relationship with a designated narcotics trafficker. Actually, they had relationships with two of them. The SDN2, as in the notice, introduced the U.S. person to SDN1, and the U.S. person had a relationship where they basically wound up taking the SDN to dinner and wound up doing other things and buying gifts and other things for the SDN. So essentially dealing in the property of the SDN. It wasn't a huge settlement, but I think the purpose was to send notice to U.S. persons that they can potentially get in trouble just in the same way the companies can. And so I do think this is something that a message that OFAC wanted to send, and is probably one that is more common, or the conduct is more common than you would think. And so I think that is really the takeaway from this is, people can be in OFAC sites as well.
Yeah, I think this can be really boiled down, not to be too glib here, to don't date an SDN without OFAC authorization. Yep. When we say stay sanctions free, this is literally what we mean.
This is what we were talking about.
This is literally what we're talking about. I think there's also the point that this was a person, obviously, that was military, it sounds like, that was stationed at the embassy. So yep. That's a community that OFAC wants to be speaking to remind them that those folks have these types of obligations and they can't be, engaging in this type of activity with SDNs. It's not as if, as Tim said, with an individual, it's not as if they can have a detailed recitation at the end about how they have to improve their compliance program or increase their internal audit, function to monitor ongoing compliance with this. So it is a bit of a strange one, but I do think that it's one that we wanted to call out because you don't see this very often. I also would say kudos to this person and their lawyers. No names mentioned in this.
That's pretty good.
No name of the individual, no names of the SDNs. It's all just placeholders and anonymous. So
Yeah.
I can see why that would make a lot of sense. And I'm not saying, again, I'm complimenting the people who accomplish that. That's great, because Tim and I would certainly be trying to do the same thing if we were representing somebody in that position.
Yep.
And obviously a lot of the value in the corporate resolutions is a bit of the name and shame. You put a name up there, it's, especially if it's a well-known company, a lot of people take notice of it. Obviously, I don't think you would have had the same benefit here. It's more the circumstances that are compelling. So, in any event, one that we wanted to call attention to, which is a bit of an outlier case. So one to look at if you haven't looked at it previously. So moving on to the next topic, which is another recent OFAC settlement. This is very recent. We are recording this on September 10th. This was just released yesterday, September 9th. This is a resolution and a settlement that was published between OFAC and Deutsche Bank Trust Companies Americas. And it's relating to essentially two separate, at least types of violations or apparent violations relating to the Russia-Ukraine sanctions. The first of which, and I think they're kind of, this matter kind of exemplifies some kind of critical kind of core compliance considerations that we talk about a lot on this podcast and that we talk to our clients a lot about. So I think highlighting those is useful. So the first area is essentially there was a large transfer of funds that DBTCA was involved in, and it involved, and they knew it involved at least a property interest, or at least a potential property interest relating to an SDN. And they were told orally by another party, a lawyer, it seems like, for not the account holder, but somebody else, that the property interest that SDN had in this property had been extinguished. They were also told this had to happen fast, it needed to go through quickly, and they basically accepted that representation and did no additional due diligence. It turned out that was wrong. The property interest was still live, so they dealt in the property of an SDN by completing that transfer through New York. And moreover, it turns out that the SDN that was involved had been put on the list only a week before this all happened. So if given the name and the nature of the transaction and the fact that they were a freshly added SDN, and this was involving the purchase of fuel oil that was apparently critical to their business in a very large sum of money, almost $30 million that was at issue in the wire transfer. And there was, according to the write-up, there was no additional due diligence done beyond the sort of the word of the external counsel that was privy to some of this. And so OFAC essentially says, well, that wasn't good enough, and so we're going to hold you responsible for that. And then the other side of it was kind of separately, also related to Russia. There were 61 transactions that involved a blocked Russian financial institution. And apparently this was missed in the screening of DBTCA, in part because they did not include in their screening function the SWIFT business identifier codes that are provided as part of the SDN listing. That is typically, if known, it will be provided as part of the listing. That was not part of their screening package, so they didn't actually check for that. And they were essentially, it looks like they were screening for only 100% word match, so there was no fuzziness in their screening tool. So they were seeing, it appears, only a very narrow band of entities, and it didn't catch. And so there were 61 transactions that went through there. So on the sort of screening side and on the broader kind of due diligence transactional side, I think these are sort of some red flags and some lessons that we talk about a lot that are useful, I think, for anybody to look at who certainly is involved in financial services that deals in any of these types of transactions, cross-border or otherwise. So I think with that, that's about all I have to say about it.
Yeah, I have very little to say too. I mean, it seems like another one of these, like, don't rush in the compliance context, right? And this happens a lot. Compliance people get these questions in, and the business side is like, we got to have an answer yesterday, got to go now. And sometimes that's prompts mistakes. And there have been a lot of screening cases. Really, I'd say if there was one big trend, enforcement trend in the last year or so, it's been that screening misses are more and more prevalent. And so, don't tune your screen too high, and be careful, trying to figure out whether there are true matches is really all of the takeaways from yesterday's.
And if OFAC gives you Swift codes, make sure that the Swift codes are integrated into your screening. So
yeah, absolutely.
So with that, let's move on to the next topic. We are flying. This is a true lightning round episode. I'm very proud. I'm proud of us. I'm very proud of us.
Don't speak too fast.
Yeah, maybe we'll get derailed here. So Tim's favorite topic. Let's go to Nord Stream 2.
Nord Stream 2. So we've talked about Nord Stream 2 quite a bit. Back in CATSA, there were sanctions that could have applied to Nord Stream 2. The State Department said that the sanctions don't necessarily apply to Nord Stream 2, although earlier this summer in July, the State Department said that the CATSA sanctions in Section 232 potentially do apply to Nord Stream 2. Congress passed the law back in December of this year. We talked about it on an earlier episode of the podcast called PISA that applied a different set of sanctions, secondary sanctions to Nord Stream 2, at least to vessels that were helping to lay the last few miles of the pipeline. Those sanctions were supposed to be accompanied by a list of vessels that were helping Russia complete the pipeline. That never happened. And part of the reason that there really hasn't, at least in my view, there really hasn't been much pressure to impose any real sanctions on Nord Stream 2 is that Germany is strongly opposed to any sanctions, and obviously Germany is an important ally, and Germany is going to be the beneficiary of this project. And so although the US has been very vocal in opposing Nord Stream 2, it really has not imposed sanctions yet. The big development recently, although this one still seems to be fizzling, is that Germany has welcomed Alexei Navalny, who is the opposition leader in Russia, or was the opposition leader in Russia, was apparently poisoned using some sort of chemical weapons agent, similar to some other critics of the Russian government over the past few years. Some of those have resulted in the imposition of chemical weapons treaty sanctions. So Germany welcomed in Mr. Navalny after he was poisoned, and he's being treated in Berlin, as I understand it. The Chancellor Merkel and her foreign minister were, in the last week or so, quoted as saying that the Russian action with respect to Mr. Navalny does prompt the possibility of halting the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Now, how that was going to happen was subject to discussion, or at least subject to some kind of media discussion about whether the Germans would just allow the U.S. and others who'd wanted to sanction the project and wanted to kill the project to now impose sanctions. And so that was the talk until really the last couple of days. And it looks like, at least behind closed doors, Chairman Merkel and her Chancellor Merkel and her economy minister have now played down the possibility of halting Nord Stream 2 and say that they need to look more closely at the issue, and maybe they were a little bit hasty in that talk. But that does, that is, at least for a little while, look like there might be a real threat to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline completion. Because if Germany turns on this issue, I do think that there is such a framework for imposing sanctions that sanctions might actually come into play and might actually create some real impediments to finishing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Yeah, I think the message that seems to be coming through now in the most recent reporting on this is that Germany and Chancellor Merkel have decided strategically to sort of decouple the Nord Stream 2 issue from the broader question of whether or not this action should be met with some type of sanctions response from Germany or the EU or otherwise. And I think that issue is very much alive. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the United States does something along those lines, as we have responded in past circumstances that resemble this, where critics of the Russian government have been killed or seriously injured by virtue of poisoning or otherwise. So I keep an eye on that. I could certainly imagine that we may see more there. But I think Tim is right that it's depending on who you believe and what you read, the threat of U.S. sanctions in the, whether it be CAATSA or PISA, or there's another law that's still being discussed right now in Congress that
Yep.
would further kind of enhance what was put in place in late 2019 to go after an even broader set of actors who were in, potentially facilitating the pipeline construction project. It's sort of unclear sort of how effective those have been in terms of a deterrent effect. Anecdotally, it seems that there's been some deterrent effect, but at the same time, it certainly seems like the pipeline's proceeding and will be finished at some point, because folks in Russia and the relevant countries are willing to sort of disregard the risk that comes with any U.S. actions unilaterally on this or EU actions. So whether this now ratchets that up or changes that calculus is hard to say. I think there will likely be some action that is taken in response to the poisoning of Navalny, but whether that has any direct impact on Nord Stream 2, I think is very difficult to say. And the more time passes, I think the less likely it becomes that is explicitly tied to the pipeline.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the effectiveness of the sanctions is ultimately going to turn on whether Germany gets on board. And I think Germany, after an initial dart in that direction and really changing these sanctions from paper sanctions to possibly real tools to change behavior, took a deep breath and said maybe they can go in a different direction, because the pipeline, by all accounts, is very, very important to the German government and to the German economy.
Right. So I have a hard time believing that they're truly going to scuttle the whole project for this, but stay tuned, because I think there will be more action sanctions-wise, whether again from the EU, Germany, or the US in response to the Navalny action. So we will keep our eyes on that. With that, let's move on to the next topic, which is Venezuela. We haven't hit on Venezuela too much recently. There's not a lot additional to report, other than there were another set of designations that came out last week against 4 individuals that are tied in with the Maduro regime. This time mostly focused on their efforts allegedly or purportedly to undermine sort of free and fair elections to be held in Venezuela later this year. So it's good to see the United States cares about having free and fair and open elections in Venezuela.
Voting is good. Voting is good.
Voting is good. If you're listening and you're living in the United States, please vote. Or anywhere. But I think the question that I really wanted to raise here, or the one comment I would have is, I feel like we're in a bit of a wash, rinse, repeat cycle with Venezuela, where the same strategy has kind of been in place for, quite some time, 12, 18 months plus now, in terms of these high profile actors connected to Maduro, going after them, the big criminal case that we've talked about previously on the pod, anything related to PDVSA or oil shipments, or the attempts by the regime to extract financial gain from oil or gold or any of the other resources in the country. I think it just begs the question, sort of, again, if regime change is the ultimate goal here, or, as the US would have it and other allies would have it, that there is already an interim president that has been identified. And so the regime has changed, although we all know as a reality, that's not exactly the case. When are we going to either declare victory or change course, or is this going to be the sort of perpetual state we're in indefinitely with respect to Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I definitely think that the U.S. goes back and forth over what its policy is there, and that these designations, in my view, get at a more achievable goal. If the goal is to force a new election that is free and fair, that seems to me to be achievable. You can obtain international consensus. I think it's a goal that could continue into a Biden administration. If Biden wins the election, it certainly would continue into a Trump administration if Trump wins the election. And so it seems manageable and potentially achievable, although it hasn't been achieved yet. Because I think ultimately you might be able to get the international community to force Maduro to undergo some sort of basically free and fair election. What you're never going to be able to achieve with sanctions, in my view, is to get the current administration to just agree to give up power. And
To walk
just,
away.
I mean, right? I mean,
Walk away.
we're still
Yeah.
trying with Castro. I mean, and he's not even around anymore. I mean, so that just never has worked historically, and it's just, especially if you don't have international consensus on that. And I don't think you would be able to achieve international consensus as easily, although there has been quite a bit of international support for President Guaido. And so I think ultimately with Venezuela, the U.S., these designations, in my view, are aimed at a more achievable, manageable goal. If they stay on that path, they might actually be able to create some behavior modification in Venezuela, but we'll see if they stay on that path, or if they kind of then veer towards just a pure, like, let's throw Maduro out of power no matter how it takes, in which case you don't need sanctions, you need an army, in my view.
Right. Okay. So with that, let's put Venezuela aside. So that brings us, so we are right on track. Let's pause again for another bookend sound effect. We are just full lightning in this episode, as we promised you. No China, although Tim did mention China. That was he
It was
when we were talking about North
inadvertent.
Korea. Yeah, inadvertent. We'll let that go. That was a technical foul. But
you can just give me a warning letter.
Yeah, warning, cautionary letter. So
yeah, exactly.
So this brings us to the last topic, which is the wild card round. So as I said, I have some trivia, but I'm going to let Tim go first, and then we'll save the trivia for last. So
all right. So mine is going to be very quick, and it was off the top of my head, but it is something that I've been thinking about. So we are now in almost mid-September. I mean, September 10th is mid-September when this is released. It will definitely be mid-September. To this point, OFAC has 10 enforcement actions this year and has imposed a total of $11 million in fines. I'm not an advocate for bigger fines, don't get me wrong, or for more fines or for more enforcement actions. But if you looked at about the same time last year, OFAC had 20 enforcement actions and about $1.1 billion in fines. Now, some of those were flukes, in the sense that, you know, the $1 billion number really was a couple of big bank settlements where the conduct was old, and so they just happened to settle in 2019. But you know, those have been happening many years, and so I don't think that 2019 was overly representative on the enforcement side. It probably was slightly more than earlier years because of the big settlements, but 20 settlements in the first 9 months of the year is probably not that many historically, whereas this year we've got half that many. So I guess what I would throw out to you, Brian, and I'll offer two quick hypotheses on this. Is this COVID? And my view is that it's a little bit COVID and a little bit, no big enforcement actions to this point. But I also think that at least part of it is just kind of the historic ebb and flow with sanctions actions. And so sometimes you'll see a lot of settlements because they just happen to come in bunches, but that there isn't a huge slowdown at OFAC, but I do think there is some sort of a COVID-related slowdown at OFAC.
Yeah, so I will agree with you that this is at least partially COVID-related. As we know from the various agencies that we have matters before currently, including OFAC, things are just moving slower and have been moving slower for the past 6 months, and that's just the reality of doing business these days in 2020. I would also say that my theory would also be that there has been so much effort and emphasis and resources devoted to program expansion at OFAC, and also just to designations and to just massive, the pace of designations as the administration and as the Treasury Department is fond of pointing out, has outstripped anything in the past that we've ever seen. So and that's across the board. And this is actually ties into my trivia question, which we're going to get to in a minute. And so I think that the focus on the program expansion, Hong Kong is brand new, ICC is brand new, GLOMAG has gotten a lot more action this year. Iran and in
the
Syria,
Uyghurs.
the Uyghurs. Yeah, all of those programs have been either are brand new or have seen upticks in action. Plus, you have the old stalwarts like Iran and the Kingpin Act and all the other things. So I think it's that. I think it's
Great
to the
point.
extent there are resources and enforcement is thought of in a broader way than just settlements. I think OFAC would come back and say, what are you talking about? Our enforcement is more vigorous than ever, and it's more widespread, and it's more effective because of that.
Because of all the designations. But I do think that the increasing number of sanctions programs has got to take a toll in terms of enforcement, because it takes a lot of resources to open a new program. I mean, with the executive order and figuring out the regs and figuring out what the general licenses will be. So yeah, I agree that it's a potential diversion of resources as well. And there are a lot of designations. I actually, maybe on the next one, we'll go back and look at that, because I put together a slide recently. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but the designations are big this year. My recollection is that that there's actually a lot in Syria. Which I hadn't realized. I looked at it to do a training, and there were more.
When we talked about the Caesar Act, I think we looked at that a little bit, and we'll get our army of dedicated interns to look at that and put some numbers together for us for the next episode.
Our masses
the massive team of interns that we have that help us do the podcast. So that is a perfect segue, amazingly enough, to my trivia question.
I'm nervous now.
All right, here's the trivia question for you. So again, the same massive team of interns helped me pull this all together. So
you have research at your disposal.
Exactly. So for those who are familiar with the OFAC website, there is the country and sanctions program page, which lists out all active sanctions programs that are either subject matter, like the Kingpin Act, or country, like Iran, Syria, North Korea. So there are currently somewhere north of 30 active programs. As we said, there have been a few new ones that have been instituted just this year. And so there's quite a number, although we tend, again, for loyal listeners of this program, they know we tend to talk about maybe 5 to 10 that, in all honesty, are the highest priority, that take up the most time, that take up the most effort, that are the biggest worries to compliance professionals around the world. And so, there's a handful, half a dozen to 10 perhaps, that we spend most of the time talking about. But again, 30 plus. On that same page, on the right-hand side of the page, there's a column that says program last updated. And that gives a date, which indicates the last time that there were designations under the program, or a new FAQ issued, or new regulations, or whatever, some kind of substantive update to the program. In doing this incredibly in-depth research, I realized, or our team of interns realized, that our crack team of interns realized that of all those 30 plus programs, there are only 3 that have not been updated or had any action taken under the current administration. Only 3. Every other program, there has been something that has been that has happened or been updated under the program. So that's 30 plus programs. So that's pretty remarkable. The question for you, Mr. O'Toole, can you name the 3 programs that have not had any action or been updated under the current presidential administration?
I doubt it. So I'm going to take a wild guess on this.
Do not go to the OFAC website.
I can't. I've got the Google off. So
bar trivia rules apply here. So no honor code. Nobody's using Google.
Nobody's using Google. Yeah. So I just guessing, because there's been no real activity there lately, although it was threatened, potentially the Iraq program.
That's a good guess, but no, it's a good guess. There was, I think 2017 was the last time there was anything to do with Iraq, good guess, but no, unfortunately.
All right.
We'll do a 3 strikes you're out rule here, so we don't put us over the 60 minutes.
So another country where there has not been a lot sanctions related recently has been Libya, but I actually so that would be my second guess, but that doesn't sound right.
Also incorrect. and then 2 strikes. So you
strikes.
You got to choke up on the bat here.
So I'll take my final guess is one where there probably should have been sanctions activity, but maybe there wasn't. And so I'm going to guess Belarus for my last guess.
Also wrong. So you're down swinging on 3 pitches. So
all right.
The correct answer.
Let's hear this.
Lebanon.
Which
nothing since 2010.
Surprising.
And I would also add that the Lebanon program was really stood up in connection with concerns about Syria. So there's obviously a lot of activity with Syria, but nothing in Lebanon since 2010. Yemen. Nothing in Yemen since...
That stuns me.
Nothing in Yemen since 2015, when there were some designations in 2015. And then the final answer to the question, Burundi, 2016. Last time any action in Burundi. I believe that was right around the time the program was stood up too. So those are the 3 answers. So Lebanon, Yemen, Burundi. And so if you want to know, if you're having a discussion internally at your company, at your law firm, what countries subject to US sanctions could be readjusted in the risk matrices that you have, I would say those 3 are probably 3 that you might want to consider. Yeah,
I'd be careful, especially with Yemen. I'm kind of stunned.
Fair.
I mean, like, if there's a change in administration, I'm guessing that changes as well.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. And the type of activities that were the repressive sort of human rights related activities that are being targeted there in terms of the internal strife going on in Yemen, I think has just been obviously a much lower priority for this administration than perhaps in the past. So yes, there's nothing set in stone that those are going to be remaining idle, so to speak. And also, to the extent anybody from OFAC is listening to this, please don't take this as a challenge to do something with respect to those 3 programs, because that's not what this is meant to be.
It's what's going to happen is they're going to take action in all 3 of those programs tomorrow, so that by the time we release this, there won't be any correct answers.
Correct. And also the KGB will probably poison our tea at some point in the next 5 days for even bringing up Navalny on this podcast.
Don't even joke about
that. That's a joke. That is a joke. So with that, I think
Putin, if you're listening.
Yeah, Vlad, we are just kidding. So with that, I think we are officially done with the lightning round episode. We basically avoided China the entire time, and we have brought this in under 60 minutes as promised. So I feel very proud of us, and we've really accomplished something. Now, of course, the next time I'm sure we will revert to talking about all China all the time. I would suspect, though, as we creep closer to the election, we will also be talking about this. Actually, today there were just some the cyber EO. There were some sanctions targeting some cyber actors under the cyber EO relating to election interference. So I think we will, in all likelihood, be coming to that as well. But I think we'll be back to some old favorites next time around.
I want to talk about Mulan next time too.
Okay. I want to hear more about any traumatic high school trivia.
Well, I mean, you've just given me PTSD because now I've failed at trivia again on the spot. But this time I wasn't even close, so that's good.
Well, I don't judge you for not knowing the words to Mrs. Robinson verbatim, so it's okay.
I was pretty close.
So with that, thank you all for tuning in. As always, if you enjoy the pod, please subscribe. Please give us a 5-star rating. You can find us anywhere: Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, YouTube, anywhere you get your pod content. And this one's been a little more fun than usual because we've covered, to keep it interesting for ourselves and hopefully you, a much more diverse range of topics. So I'm sure we will come back to this format at some point in the future, given how wildly successful it was this time around. Exactly. But with that, until next time, please stay safe and stay sanctions free.
Stay safe, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.